This morning we're going to talk about what we put into the snapshot. We will have, as Emily said, the questions in the chat, and we will take a little break between the snapshot and the industry presentations to answer some of those questions before we hand off to Izumi. And that's it. Let's get started. So the big question, of course, is how much PV was installed last year, and we will go through this. But a little bit of information about how we do this. First of all, our data comes on the one hand from our PVPS Task 1 experts. We have a long-standing methodology that we use, which means that sometimes our numbers are a little bit different from other organizations, and we'll talk about that because it's really important. But we also adapt our methodology to changes in the global context of PV, and you'll be able to see why this is important. So, published since 2013. I've been working on it for the last 3-4 years now, and really happy to be able to share the thoughts of our PVPS Task 1 members in this new report. We have a new format this year. We've gone to a landscape. I know it's just format and not the content, but we're trying to keep up with the new way that everyone reads and things like this. I hope you enjoy this new format. So how much PV was installed last year? Well, our analysis brings us up to just about 700 gigawatts. I would have liked to have gone over, but that's not what our numbers are showing. You will see here that we have a substantial increase from 2024 and 2023, and you will see something new in our graphs this year. We have, as in the past few years, uncertainty in the China numbers, but we also have another little bar called other uncertainty. And we have also some markets that are becoming increasingly major. So we've integrated them so that you can see their progression over the past several years. So 700 gigawatts. This is, when we compare to what we had 15 years ago, this is really, really pleasing and high numbers. Most of this, of course, is in China. We can see a large proportion of this is in China. We have gone from about 350 gigawatts up to 415 in the IEA PVPS methodology. So a large proportion is in China, and a smaller proportion is the rest of the world. We're still not that far off the 50-50, but the markets are definitely being led by China. 700. Some of you may have seen some organizations have already published their estimations of 2025 data and are coming out around 600. Some of them are even underneath that. How have we developed our numbers? So we have 535 confirmed DC power installed. We have another estimated 70 gigawatts, and then we have about 90 gigawatts is on expert guess and uncertainty ratios, and this brings us up to our 698. Why is this important? Okay, so the first thing, we publish DC volumes. Why do we publish DC volumes? Because DC volumes is what it allows us to have an understanding of the business value of the PV markets. It allows us to have an understanding of the volume of kilowatt hours that are being generated. And of course, when you are installing PV, if you go and talk to a developer or in the residential sector, an installer, they are installing DC volumes. So DC volumes, the volumes of the modules, not the volumes of the maximum power capacity coming out of the inverters. But why do we have some estimated values? Why do we have some expert guess? And why do we have some confirmed? Because, for a starter, not all countries register PV data. Europe, long tradition, the USA, China, yes. That there's a lot of countries, South America and Africa, that do not actively register PV volumes. Not all countries register all PV data. And this is increasingly important because we know that there are an increasing number of very small systems, sometimes called balcony, sometimes called plug and play, that are being installed across countries behind the meter that don't necessarily get registered. But we also know that repowering is not registered in a lot of countries either. So not all countries register all PV volumes. Not all countries know their standard DCAC ratios, and these ratios vary from one country to the other. So when data is collected, often by distribution grid managers or TSOs, it is often registered in AC, and this has to be converted to DC for us to have a comparative base around the world. And this varies from one country to the other. In Europe, it's often about 1.2. Countries close to the equator, it could be more 1.5. So it's variable from one country to the other. And finally, and this is relatively new, the DCAC ratios are currently undergoing a quick divergence between what's installed in decentralized rooftop PV, where the DCAC ratios are pretty standard, unless we add in storage. The DCAC ratios of centralized, which tend to be higher, and the co-located systems, the utility scale systems that are co-located with PV and storage, where the DCAC ratios are even higher. And we'll talk about this a little bit later as well, but to understand this, we have DCAC ratios going from 1.2 all the way up to 2, with some outliers hitting 4 or 5 for the very few firm power systems that are coming online. So this is a really big range. And of course, registering data, if they don't collect DC and AC at the same time, these have to be estimated, which explains why we have this really big range. We think it's important to talk about this range. There's a lot of organizations that publish a single figure, and that's really important for them because it works into their methodology and what they can do. But the reality is that we are all guessing on certain elements, and this is why we've put in this range. That said, we can give some indicative values, and this year we have top 5 installed capacity in the year, which hasn't changed very much. We have a little bit of a new order for India and USA. India's pipped the USA at the post. Cumulative values, it doesn't change very much because there's quite a long lead time on improving the cumulative value. However, places 6 to 10, we do have some changes, especially in the annual installed capacity here. One of the things we've seen, for example, is that in the MENA region, as very large systems come online, depending on how you measure what year the installed capacity is added, Saudi Arabia, for example, has come into that top 10. And we know there's a long installation times, and sometimes some organizations will count the volumes when they're installed, some will count them when they're commissioned. We tend to count them when they're commissioned, and this is why Saudi Arabia gets in here. The cumulative capacity, Pakistan has jumped in there. There is a big uncertainty margin on Pakistan, and for those that follow global volumes, you will understand this. There is a disconnect between the registered volumes. Each year we'd only measure behind the meter official volumes and the import volumes and what's really happening. So a lot of discussion within our task 1 groups and with different experts to evaluate how much is in Pakistan, but whichever way we look at it, we're pretty confident that they've now entered the top 10 for cumulative capacity. Top of that doesn't change much, which is witnessing the strong and continued strong markets that we have, for example, in Germany. India's growing. What does this mean in terms of growth or growth rates? This is a little graph that I like to do because it shows us how things are evolving over time. One of the things we must remember that anything is positive means that the markets are growing. Anything that's negative means we're in stagnation. Even 0% means we're getting the same volumes as last year. So what is this showing us? This is showing us that we have some countries with small volumes have very high growth rates, but it's easy to have a high growth rate when you go from 1 to 2 giga in a year. We have Pakistan that's appearing here. High uncertainty factor on this. All we need to know is the markets are growing very highly. We've got a slight decrease on 2024 between 2024 and 2025. There's a large level of uncertainty, and if this volume, it's hard to say. But the compound annual growth rate over 2 years is probably more correct than individual annual rates. And then finally, we have some countries that have a CACG, a compound annual growth rate that's still over 100%. India, very healthy market. China, 32%. It's still a very healthy growth rate, even if it looks a lot lower than the other ones. There's a lot of markets and a lot of industries where they'd be really pleased with sort of growth rate. Please, I've put Turkey in there just to show you what happens when around this question of when is data installed or commissioned. In Turkey, there's a lot of, there's been several years in a row, a lot of commissionings that are happening late December, and this has a rather large impact when you're calculating annual growth rates. So I wouldn't look at the individual 2022, 2023 data. It's the average that we want to look at, and it's pretty stable. But so we have quite a lot of variety in there. European countries, where Germany, Spain, France, overall, still slightly positive growth rates. Where we're seeing a bit more stagnation is Japan, for example. We don't have South Korea on here, but it's the same. We have pretty steady markets that are neither going up a lot or going down a lot. So as you saw from our annual volumes, China still leads development, but we can see on this graph that we have India taking a larger and larger share of global volumes every year. We have the rest of EU, Germany and Spain very steady, USA quite steady as well. We have Brazil coming in there as a significant. But the rest of the world is also installing PV. So Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, they're also installing PV in increasingly large volumes. And if it doesn't seem like much on the graph, it's because we have China leading the way. But when we look at the rest of the world, this is not insignificant at all. So what does this mean in terms of cumulative capacity? Well, I was very disappointed when I added everything up and we didn't quite hit 3 terawatts. Given the uncertainty, I am betting that we've gone over that. We're well over 3 terawatts right now, which I think is something really we can celebrate. It took 40 years to get to 1 terawatt, and it took only another 3 years to get to 3. The big question is, how soon are we going to be able to hit a 1 terawatt market per year? Probably not that soon. The growth we've had is, particularly in China, is probably unsustainable. For those of you that have read through the snapshot this year, you will see that we talk a lot about the impact of curtailment, grid congestion, and these subjects really are something that is going to be dictating how a lot of these markets grow over the coming years. One way of illustrating this is that both centralized and decentralized markets are growing, but we had kind of expected that the centralized markets would grow a lot faster than they were if we look at previous years' growth rates. However, we've noticed that there's a kind of a more equal stabilization between the two. And this is really a reflection of the grid constraints that are happening around the world, whether it be in the USA, in China and Australia, in Europe, where the ability to connect is dictated by capacity, permitting procedures, and even the availability of system elements such as transformers that are slowing the rate of installation of centralized and utility scale systems. Distributed PV is still growing. We had a significant jump when electricity prices went up through different parts of the world in 2022, 2023, but they're still growing. We suspect that we're not capturing all of the distributed PV. Off-grid PV is also growing, and these things are hard to track. So we may be a little bit higher in here. One of the things we talk about often is China is leading. If you've been following the PV market for a long time, you know that often we will say, oh, so Europe was an early leader. But what I'd like to illustrate is that Europe led global cumulative volumes effectively up until about 10 years ago. But 10 years ago, our cumulative volumes were very, very small. So I think it's really important to be able to understand that even though different regions have different places in here, the impact and the absolute contribution to cumulative markets really has no comparison 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and what's happening today. We hope to see a more balanced market because, of course, and Izumi was talking about this in her industry presentation, but we have a single concentrated market that is pulling the whole global market. This, of course, is an introduction of a certain fragility because industry becomes very dependent on that particular market. And this is something that will be developed later on, but it's been the case now for several years, and it has increased year on year, with China going from a third of global markets and now hitting 50%. What's going to happen next year with the changes, the structural changes that have been happening in China in the way that they have been pulling the national market, we'll see. But this is a very significant event, and it seems important that we head towards a more stabilized market if we want to have something that is safe and healthy around the world. Solar, 3 terawatts, right? Huge amount. Solar has been leading the way, just as China has been leading in terms of installed volumes. Solar has been leading on the global deployment of renewable energy systems. This is kind of unprecedented, the development of solar. It is a significant and major contributor. We have seen this for 10 years now, that solar has been dominating global deployments. Wind power, slow growth, important but slow. Solar, because of the price drops, because of the added value to the Chinese manufacturing industry, because of the services it supplies both on decentralized and utility scale markets, because of the unbeatable levelized cost of electricity, solar has been the major number one renewable technology that's been deployed for several years, and last year was not any different to that. However, solar has a lower capacity factor, which means for the individual power that's installed, it will produce less energy than wind, onshore, offshore, or hydro. Of course, this is because it follows a diurnal rhythm. It doesn't generate electricity at nighttime. It only generates electricity during the day, and it generates, for those countries and those latitudes that have seasonal variations, it will generate a lot more in summer seasons than winter seasons. So the capacity factor is lower, which means even though it is largely dominant in capacity deployment, the contribution of last year's capacity is proportionally lower than the new capacity of wind and hydro. This doesn't mean that it's not useful, of course. It just means we're deploying it a different way, a different rhythm in a different way. And this is an important indicator of why those energy systems that are deploying solar and wind at the same time are reaching more stable renewable energy generation than those that are just deploying solar, because they're very complementary between them. Another thing that is complementary between this with solar is that it meets centralized consumption, centralized demand requirements, but also decentralized consumption requirements. What does this mean on a national level? We're deploying solar around the world. We saw everywhere it's dominant. On a country by country level, what is this supplying in the electricity system? And this is a really interesting question. We've evaluated the PV penetration that these volumes of PV will have to this year's electricity demand. So we estimate the total number of kilowatt hours that the installed capacity at the end of 2025 will generate in 2026, and we compare this to 2025 electricity demand, sometimes 2024 electricity demand, depending on what data we have. So this is the minimum expected PV penetration in 2026. There are uncertainty bars. One is on the installed volumes, and the other is the expected PV penetration before and after curtailment. So we've just extrapolated last year's curtailment to this year's curtailment. Of course, this is underestimating the curtailed volumes. We know it's a principal subject around the world. So lots of curtailed volumes in Spain, in Australia, even in France, small islands, Cyprus, Malta, countries like Chile and Brazil. We know they had a lot of curtailment as well. They're not necessarily extremely well documented. In a lot of European countries, we may have commercial curtailment, which means it's not led by the grid managers, but it's led by the operators, where electricity prices on the market go down to zero or negative. So the commercial curtailment is happening on a voluntary basis. So there's a bit of uncertainty in here, but we think that globally, PV will contribute at least 10.6% to global electricity demand in 2026. One of the important things, as we talked about half of the cumulative installed volume is decentralized, and electricity demand is not electricity consumption. So electricity demand is what we have generated. We then we take off from electricity demand, network and grid losses, electricity used within power consumption, and net electricity imports, and we get electricity consumption. So from country to country, electricity demand is always higher than electricity consumption. So electricity consumption is what has been consumed by end users. And because demand is not equal to consumption, the average expected minimum PV penetration for electricity consumption this year is 12%. So significantly higher than its contribution to demand. And the reason there is this difference between the two is because many countries have very high network losses. So this is not PVPS data, but this is from the World Bank using IEA data. Power transmission and distribution losses range from about 3% up to 20% from country to country. A lot of the South American and African countries, we have very high distribution grid losses, but we also have countries with very high PV deployment that also have high grid losses, notably in India. So it means that the contribution of decentralized production is actually a lot higher, because decentralized production, the energy is consumed at the place of generation, no grid losses. So even though we do a kind of mathematical contribution to PV consumption, it's probably higher than this. And we're hitting the high 20s in quite a lot of countries. So global average might be 12%, but we have a lot of countries where we're well into the 20s and some that we're probably up into the 30s. Pakistan, this is a mathematical number, 45%. Please don't take that as religion because it's not that. There's such a high level of uncertainty about what's happening and probably a lot of curtailment as well. So I've put it in there, but just please be aware this is not likely what's happened. But Cyprus, for example, small island, large amount of curtailment. Greece as well, I haven't got it in here, but a lot of this is happening. The question of curtailment is an interesting one, and I've talked about the higher DC-AC ratios on collated storage, and I thought it was interesting to show you that stationary battery storage is growing very fast, as is the development and the sale of light electrical vehicles. And if the curves don't perfectly overlap, it's important to understand that PV is no longer in a vacuum. These three elements are pulling each other. I don't think any particular one is leading and pulling the other two. They work together. In the residential sector, people investing in PV are discovering that they can associate it with electrical vehicles to have a home synergy between their generation and their transport needs. And as grid constraints go up, as balancing issues arise, as we get negative electricity prices, sorry, on the spot market, and as curtailment increases, countries are increasingly requesting utility scale developers to co-locate with storage. And India is a really good example of this, but China as well. And also increasingly in countries that have increasing data centers where we see that they are turning to PV plus storage as a response to the electricity needs. So stationary battery storage is growing very fast and is also enabling further development of utility scale PV. And I just think this is a really nice graph to keep in mind that nothing is developing in isolation, they're developing together. And this is probably part of the energy transition revolution, that things are becoming very interlinked with demand, generation, and system services coming together. So what can we conclude with this year's snapshot? PV market grew again, nearly 700 gigawatts DC, maybe slightly over, maybe slightly under, around this. China's growth slowed, but still remained very high. We went from a 30% growth rate to a 16%, still very high. The rest of the world's growth rate still quite considerable, not as high as last year, 15% year on year compared to 26% year on year, but it's still positive growth. Different markets are developing around the world in different ways. PV is supplying really considerable levels of electricity demand around the world. We probably have about 10 countries where it's over 20%, nearly 20 countries where it's over 15%, depending on curtailment. Curtailment is the key subject. It's impacting profitability, it's impacting penetration rates, and it's impacting how we deploy solar, the use of storage, and the use of active management. AC/DC numbers continue to confuse market statistics. That's why we have uncertainty in our different countries' data, but that's also why we think it's important to talk about this. And this is why you will also see a divergence between IEA PVPS data numbers and that which is published by other organizations. Some are publishing AC, some use different estimations in their uncertainties. We have already gone past 3 terawatts. This is the biggest news coming out of the snapshot. And just to summarize that, to hit that 1 terawatt per year, we need other markets to develop. They are developing, but it needs to go faster. Africa and Latin America specifically. But for these markets to develop, they have a number of challenges that need to be met. Grid stability is one of them. Transmission grid capacity is another of them. But as we see the penetration of co-located storage, the fragility of grids may be less and less important because storage is going to be able to spread consumption, reduce peaks. So we're going to keep a really strong eye out on how that's developing. And that's this year's snapshot. Thank you for your attention. We have a little bit of time for questions.